From Life Course Associates, here's Warren Wright.
So the name of my presentation is The Millennial Footprint on Media and Entertainment. And I'm going to make a case that generations more generally, and millennials specifically, have an outsized footprint, will have an outsized footprint on our society, on culture, on our attitudes, and ultimately on the behaviors as it relates to media and entertainment. And I'm going to start the presentation by talking about a generation that's not the millennials. We love them, and they especially love themselves. This is the baby boomers, or also known as your parents. So what's the baby boomer story? Well, actually, it's pretty interesting. They were brought up at a time of remarkable prosperity in the United States. GDP tripled between World War II and the 70s when they were growing up. And instead of being really grateful for all that wealth that was created, they kind of rebelled, and they actually turned inward against all this conventionality and this moving to the suburbs and the Ozzie and Harriet. And the most interesting part, of course, as we all know about the boomers is the 60s. We call it the 60s, but it's between the late 60s and early 70s. And the epicenter of this great rebellion and cultural upheaval, the stew of cultural dissent, as it were, took place in the San Francisco Bay Area. San Francisco Bay Area was a really interesting time back then. It was a place of kind of a mashup between hippies and tech people. And a guy named Walter Isaacson actually just wrote a book called The Innovators, and in it he documents that the personal computer, which is one of the greatest kind of social changing instruments of our time, would never have been invented without the baby boomers, a couple of guys, kind of hippie geeks, in their garage, two guys named Steve, Wozniak and Jobs, figured out how to build microprocessors. And they did it because it was cool, but they also did it so they could unhook from the grid, unhook from the mainstream, do their own thing, and a little bit of stick it to the man, okay? So this was the nature of the personal computer and how it changed everything. Fast forward 20 years, Generation X, very different experience growing up. The economy wasn't so good. This was a time of rising crime, a time of, they were known as the ignored generation. I don't know if you remember the movie Home Alone. The parents get on the plane and they look at each other and they say, "Oh my God, Kevin, we forgot Kevin." And so in the audience, we're like, "Oh my God, they forgot their 9-year-old," but it was kind of funny. And so this was the great ignored generation. These were the latchkey kids. Now there's a silver lining to this generation actually, in that they became the greatest entrepreneurs of our time. So when you think about all the kind of business changing moves that took place in this time, Napster destroyed the music industry, okay? It went from $11 billion to $3 billion in about 3 years. We know that Jeff Bezos, a famous Xer, completely rewrote the rules of big box retailers. And of course, the mother lode, Google, a couple guys, Stanford engineers, come along and say, you know, this Netscape browser thing isn't working really well. I think we could do it better. And what is more interesting is they said, well, I think we could build a business model around it through advertising. And so you guys are in the advertising business. This radically changed what the nature of advertising was. They said, we're going to bring some accountability to it, and it's a pay-per-click deal. And don't think anything else, right? So Google, you think about Google Glasses and Google Cars, 93% of their revenue is from advertising. They are very much of an advertising company. In fact, Mel Karmazin, the former famed CEO of CBS, went out to meet with these guys, found out what they're doing, came back, and uttered 3 famous words: "We're screwed." Everything changed, right? Typical Generation X, they get a hold of something, they change everything. Okay. Aristotle said that generations are shaped by history and then go on, and then history is shaped by generations. And indeed, the reason I'm telling you these going through the past 40 years was to give you an idea of the cycle of growing up and change and coming of age and the influence on our culture. Now, we don't know exactly what the generational footprint is going to be, but we have a clue. We could kind of buy a clue. If we know the enduring traits and characteristics of each of the generations, we could start to understand how they shape and influence the future. Now, The millennials is a generation that we've been studying for a long time. My colleague Neil Howe gave millennials their name back in 1991 in his famous book Generations, a bestseller. And we know, for example, that they were raised by doting parents. They were raised to feel special. They are pressured. They are programmed. They are bonded to their parents. They are networked to their friends. This is a very high-achieving generation. Actually, millennials have the highest graduation rate and highest education rate of any generation in U.S. history. They fear risk. They dread failure. They like structure. And of course, they're born into the digital age. Now, okay, so the rest of the presentation, I want to talk about these three footprints. So you saw all those kind of characteristics. Well, what does that mean in terms of the influence? Well, we've identified three things that we're calling hypersocialization, first life, second life blend, and the maker movement. It's a social generation, guys, okay? So the words social and media never really was like a thing. That wasn't two words that really went together very much. As of 5 years, you never heard it, and now it is at the centerpiece of very much of this generation. I don't know if you've noticed, but millennials love everybody. They love their parents, and they love their friends, and they actually love the community they're in. They're a very kind of can-do, civic-minded, optimistic organization, a group of individuals. A study that has been done for the past 30 years, the U.S. Family Institute stated that 82% of millennials have absolutely no problem with anyone else in the family. That's a pretty high percent. Back in '93, Gen Xers, 75% of Gen Xers agreed with that statement. And boomers, you know who you are, less than 50% actually agreed with that statement. So huge, huge kind of social differences as it relates to relationship between family. Clearly, millennials put a high value on relationships. We all kind of know that. Friends are at the center of what they do, of how they think, of who they are. They are defined by their own network of friends and so forth. And it is no surprise that it was a millennial who invented a company that allowed his generation to talk to each other and communicate with each other, right? To go back and forth and find out what each other are doing and so forth. We don't think that could have happened with any other generation than with Mark Zuckerberg. Like all big movements in culture, when a big thing has happened with one generation, it tends to kind of influence the other generation, which is why 57% of everybody in the United States has a Facebook account of all generations. 73% of millennials have a Facebook account, and which accounts for roughly 500 million people worldwide. So, all right, so everybody knows what this is, right? This is a controller, a game thing. It's not just a controller. We call it an enabler. And if you notice, there's a white button on there. I'm going to get a close-up of a different one. It's called the share button. So this is an amazing story. So these people at Twitch TV, which you haven't heard of, you have to hear of them. They have 50 million unique visitors a month. That number is correct. They went to Microsoft and Sony and they said, you know, if I could put this button on this thing, it allows people to communicate with one another so they could play games together and they could broadcast and they could watch and so forth and so on. This exploded the gaming industry, which I'm going to give some more examples of later in the presentation. All right, first life, second life blend. So never before has the line been so blurry between the virtual world and the real world. Technology has almost kind of, like millennials grew up with technology, it kind of happened on their first day, right? So they're born and they are one with technology. And this is a great contributor to the comfort level they feel with technology, how they think about it, how they interact with it, so forth and so on. One of the speakers before had mentioned the company Oculus Rift. Of course, Facebook bought them for I don't know how many billions of dollars. This is a company that is in the forefront of sophisticated visual technology, and you have these wide range of industries that are using it, from law enforcement to pornography, and everybody in between is looking at Oculus Rift as a way of entertaining. And by the way, if you're spending more time with those glasses on, you spend less time watching conventional TV and less time doing things that you typically would. I didn't know IRL was a thing until about 18 months ago. I think you guys know in real life, IRL, and we're at the point where we actually have to distinguish between real life and not real life, right, and the virtual world. We never had to do that before, but we're well into the IRL world. It seems that for every event that happens, there's a doppelganger virtual event that happens. I don't know how many of you folks watched the World Cup over the summer, but there was also something else going on that's been going on for a while now, and it's the virtual World Cup, and there's 2.5 million people that play this game, and 20 to 30 million people that tune in to watch people play this game. It seems like whatever virtual thing there is also, whatever real thing there is a virtual thing. We do a lot of work for MTV in our consulting work. One of the things we found was that millennials, more than half of millennials feel that life is like a video game. And for the very first time, psychologists are noting that young people are actually dreaming in Second Life and actually dreaming in a virtual world. The last footprint is the maker movement. Now, this is a movement that's been around for a while. Maker culture is kind of learning through doing. The difference is now it's digital, and now it's social, and now we could share what it is that we create and what we do. So Pinterest and YouTube, always a cat in every presentation. I just have to do it. But this is by the way, I heard the most amazing statistic, if you remember anything of all the presentations today. Ipsos did a poll within the last few months. 30% of millennials' media time is spent with UGC, with user-generated content. That is remarkable. Again, if they're doing that more, they're doing something else less, and that has a huge implication. Of course, big business knows all about this. Disney's all over this. They purchased Maker Studio. Microsoft, of course, purchased Minecraft. They also have Spark, where players create and creators play. Brilliant. We think Maker Movement falls into two camps: education and avocation. On the avocation side, this is a screenshot of Twitch, by the way. This guy in the bottom left, not the cartoon guy, but the other guy, actually broadcasts, and millions of people watch him, and he makes $300,000 a year just playing video games. Fullscreen's another company that you'll see a lot of. They were just bought by AT&T. Robot Turtle is something, if you haven't heard of, you will. It's a game that teaches 3-year-olds how to code and program. So they're starting very, very early in getting into this stuff. So, okay, so what does this look like in the future? Now, we don't know exactly, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a clue. What is that? What is going on? Twitch pays Pokemon. Volume could go down now. Let's calm down. This is actually in real time. So this Australian guy, just some guy who remains anonymous to this day, figured out a program where multiple, and I mean multiple people, could actually play at the same time Pokemon and try to get the Pokemon guy, to the next level, right? And there's a lot of people playing against it and so forth and so on. But what's really interesting about this is that, okay, so there was 1.2 million people that played at the same time, but there was 55 million people that were looking at it and watching it. 55 million people. Now, for us, we study generations. That was a millennial moment, okay? So you have the maker movement going on. You have the virtual worlds, right? You have this kind of achievement ethic of figuring out, competition. But you do have people working together. We've learned from Barney the dinosaur. Millennials have learned to work together and work as teams and so forth, right? So all this stuff is kind of mashed together to create the new, what we believe is the new vision and new paradigm for the future. I will leave you with one slide. It's kind of my 3-word mantra that I use that I recommend that media companies think about when they think about developing new medias, new technologies, and so forth. Participate, create, and share. Participate, create, and share. If you're doing these 3 things and you're paying attention to this, you will likely have a successful model in media for the future. Thank you.
Joining Warren is Hill Holliday's Graham Ritchie.
Fantastic. Well, if any of the tweets need to go by, I think we're going to get a few interesting questions as we go on.
Great.
But I might kick it off and just start with something you said to me when we were first preparing for today's session, that this generation really, truly do see the world through the network of others rather than through their own eyes, which is perhaps what my generation did. And I guess for someone who's relatively new to America, or living in America, a country that in its DNA is the, the rise of the individual, individual rights, my own success. Do you think American values are going to change given what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, this is really an issue not just of really media habits. This is an issue of, we think, profound cultural and societal change in the United States. And as you say, I mean, we have very much of an individualistic, capitalistic society, each man for himself. I do see a different dynamic with millennials, and again, I think I mentioned Barney.
Yeah.
But the whole notion of working together as a team and as a community and being able to connect really quickly and real easily. One of the statistics that's remarkable, UCLA actually does a survey. They've been doing it for the past 40 years, and of incoming freshman students. And they asked a question about, is it important that you help others in need? And actually, that is at 70% right now, which is the highest it's ever been that they've measured in years and years. So you do have kind of more of a collectivist mentality. Right now, the Republicans are really having a hard time figuring out how to reach millennials. There's a 16-point gap between Democrats and Republicans as it relates to millennials. So you're looking at a dramatic shift. By the way, there's 100 million millennials. So it is the largest generation in U.S. history. It is the most educated. It is the most diverse. I heard a statistic the other day that's remarkable. If you line up all the 80-year-olds in the United States, 5% are non-white. And then if you line up all the people that are 5 years old or under, 52% are non-white. So millennials are the generation that really is kind of leading this diversity and togetherness charge at the same time.
Great. Well, look, thanks to Audience Express. If you've got any questions, please tweet them out and we'll ask Warren as we go. One of the things that strikes me is sort of the revenue model shifts that we're starting to see, sort of the peer-to-peer, the virtual goods, everything seeming to be free. What advice or what thoughts do you have in terms of how the entertainment industry is going to have to think about that?
In order to answer that, I need to be paid, because that is a question that no one has figured out, that we're thinking about a lot. I will tell you that one of the characteristics of the millennial generation is they're frugal, they're savvy, they're smart. I mean, no one wants, I have a son who uses my Netflix account, right? This is a generation that is not used to paying for things. And so, on the other hand, this is a generation that when they get behind a brand and they're interested in a brand, and a brand is connecting to them authentically, and as I think we learned from Rainey and a generation like, the best advertising models are the consumers and the people themselves that are using that, and that Tyler, I can't remember his name, Tyler, something that Rainey talked about is a peek into the future, I think, of revenue sharing modeling and the future of revenue in that industry.
Yeah, right. So they're used to not paying for anything.
They're used to not paying for anything. And they're starting to, the oldest millennial's 32 now, so they're starting to buy houses, they're starting to settle down and so forth, and at least make an income, at least the older ones are. The younger ones are having a much more difficult time finding jobs. The economies they came into is much worse than the older generation. But it is a dynamic that's going to be very challenging for the industry, I believe.
I'm not sure why I was so surprised, but that driving sense of achievement, something we talked about, really did sort of strike a chord. And I guess that sense of they go to each other for shared knowledge and expertise. I think the commons, and it made me really think through about, so will I be employing people in the future where it doesn't really matter about an MBA degree or a college degree at all, but what their following is, or how many like buttons they've got behind their particular area of expertise.
The value of social currency in the future is going to increase exponentially. The notion, the higher education business is in a lot of trouble right now. They have demonstrated that they are churning out kids that are not prepared for the current workforce and what the workforce needs. And clearly there is that notion of social currency and that value that brings is everything in the future, I think.
Great. Well, no questions came through, which I can't believe because of all the tweets, but we're time's up already.
Right.
But thank you very much. It's a pleasure.